They gave me to her the way you give a letter of credit to someone who doesn't need the money. A courtesy. A formality with a name attached. The treaty between the Orange Sovereignty and the Federated Reach had 17 articles. Article 14 was me, a human diplomatic attaché assigned as consort to Empress Thessavel Orn for the duration of the integration period. The treaty defined as 2 standard years, and which everyone at the table understood to mean, until we can find a more elegant way out of this. I was the bridge they'd built to cross a river they hoped would dry up on its own. My name is Cale Doran. 34 years old when I arrived at the Cathiel Gate. I had spent 11 years before that as an intelligence analyst for the Reach's Strategic Affairs Division, which is a formal way of saying I sat in small rooms and read everything anyone had ever written about a problem until I understood the problem better than the people creating it. I was not a soldier, though I had served in conflict zones. I was not a diplomat, though I had spent 2 years embedded in consular posts. I was the kind of man you send when you need someone who will not panic, who will not posture, and who can disappear into the background of a difficult situation without creating more difficulty. The Reach's selection committee had called me ideal for the posting. I understood what they meant. I was expendable in a way that a high-profile envoy was not, and I was capable enough that they could plausibly claim the assignment was an honor. Thessavel Orn received me in the great hall of the Cathiel Gate, on a gray morning in early winter, the mountain pass visible through the high windows. Behind her throne, the sky the color of cold iron. She was tall by any standard. Taller than most humans I had met. Taller than most Orn I would come to know. Skin was the warm copper rose that marked the high Orn lineage, deepened at the jaw and brow by the fat geometric lines that her people called the record marks. A kind of biological annotation, family and rank, written into the skin by generations of breeding, that the Orn considered the most honest form of autobiography. Her hair was deep auburn black, pulled back in a formal braid wound through with a thin cord of hammered gold. Her eyes, when they found me in the line of arriving delegates, were gold-flecked amber, and what I saw in them was not hostility, which would have been useful, and not curiosity, which would have been manageable. What I saw was the careful, practiced blankness of someone who has already decided not to waste the emotional energy of a reaction. She let her gaze pass over me the way water passes over a stone in a stream, moving around, not stopping. The introductions were formal and brief. Chamberlain read my title, Attaché Consort, Article 14, in a voice that managed to render the word consort simultaneously ceremonial and negligible. 2 of the Empress's senior court advisors, standing to her right, murmured something to each other behind closed hands. I had been studying the Orn's court language for 6 months by then. I caught the word they used for a placeholder, which in formal Orn translates roughly as a peg in a board, something you hang a coat on while you figure out where to actually put it. I bowed. I said the formal greeting phrase I had been given. I stood at the appropriate distance. Thessavel Orn inclined her head by the minimal fraction that protocol required, and that was the whole of our first meeting. What followed was 8 months. I want to be precise about those 8 months, because they have been described to me since in several versions, and most of the versions are wrong. The version that circulates in Reach diplomatic circles has me suffering quietly under the weight of Orn's scorn, enduring because I had no choice. The version I heard later from an Orn court historian has me oblivious to the undercurrents, a blunt instrument deployed by an empire that didn't understand the room it was walking into. Both of these are flattering in their way. The first makes me sympathetic, the second makes me harmless, and both miss what was actually happening. I knew exactly what the room was. The Cathiel Gate was a frontier fortress, old stone and older iron, built into the shoulder of a mountain pass that had been contested and reconquered 8 times in the last 4 centuries. It was not the heart of the Orn sovereignty. That was the capital, Thessavel's primary court, 3 days' travel to the south. The Cathiel Gate was a posting for important business that needed distance, negotiations, border matters, or filling questions that the capital's full court would have amplified into political spectacle. The Empress maintained it as a working fortress and a second court, leaner than the capital, harder in its edges. The people she kept here were the ones who were useful to her. Advisors who thought in straight lines, soldiers who followed orders without decoration, administrators who understood that the past had to be held, whether or not anyone was watching from the capital. I was the one anomaly. The treaty clause had put me here because the integration talks, which were ongoing, were held at neutral sites near the pass. There was no elegant reason to have me in the capital. There was a bureaucratic reason to have me close, and so I was close, which meant close to Thessaval, which meant the court at the Cathial Gate had to develop a way of arranging itself around the fact of me. The arrangement they settled on was managed indifference. No one was actively cruel to me. I was fed, housed, given access to the fortress library and the deliberation records. I was technically entitled to see. I was not excluded from court functions. I attended every formal gathering, stood in the correct place, ate the food, spoke when addressed. I was included in the way that furniture is included in a room, present, part of the arrangement, but not expected to have opinions about the arrangement. Thessaval was the same in private as in public, which is rarer than you'd expect in a ruler. She was not cold in the way of a person suppressing warmth. She was focused. She had a war on one border, a succession question that two of her houses were quietly using to position themselves, and a treaty with a human federation that she had agreed to because it was strategically necessary and that she was now administering with the efficiency of someone clearing a to-do list. I was an item on that list. She crossed me off at the morning briefing every day and moved to the next item. We spoke, in those 8 months, more than the official record would suggest. Not often, but regularly. She asked me questions about the Reach's position on various integration points, because I knew those positions in greater detail than the formal delegates did, and she was the kind of ruler who preferred to understand a thing fully before she acted on it. She was direct in those conversations. She listened carefully. She occasionally asked a follow-up question that showed she had retained everything I'd said in a previous conversation, almost verbatim. She was intellectually formidable in a way that I found genuine and would have respected in any context. She did not ask me personal questions. She did not invite me to sit. She concluded our conversations when she had what she needed and moved on. Once, in the corridor near the Western Library, she passed me with an entourage of 4, and I said her formal title and she said mine, and neither of us slowed. That was the texture of it, not war, not warmth, the careful management of an inconvenient clause. I was not suffering under it. I want to be clear about that too, because I think people assume suffering when they hear this story, and the assumption misses something important. I was not happy. I had given up 2 years of my life for a posting that had no real function, but I was not broken by the indifference either. I had grown up in circumstances that had taught me, early and thoroughly, that the question is not whether a room has made space for you. The question is whether you are of any use in the room, and whether you can hold yourself together long enough to be of use when the moment comes. I was holding myself together. I was reading everything I could get access to in the Cathial Gate library. I was watching the court at the Cathial Gate the way I had spent 11 years watching every room I was put into. I was waiting, without knowing quite what I was waiting for. And, in the meantime, I was learning every person in that fortress by their record and their behavior and the gap between the two. Veth Amriel arrived in the 2nd week of the 9th month, with a retinue of 6 and a formal written request for a sovereignty conference regarding the Amriel territory status under the integration treaty. I had read every document generated in or about the Amriel territories in the previous year. I knew who Veth Amriel was before I saw him. 40 years old by Orn reckoning, a warlord by inheritance rather than campaign, his family had held the southern mountain territories for 6 generations through a combination of tactical marriage, precise violence, and the kind of political instinct that is less about ideals than about understanding exactly where pressure can be applied. He was ambitious in the lateral way of people who do not want the throne, because they understand that the throne is a target. He wanted adjacent power. He wanted to be the person the throne needed. He wanted to be the person the throne needed more than it needed a human consort. I saw that within the first hour of his arrival, and I understood it was going to become my problem. Not because he disliked me specifically, he didn't know me well enough to dislike me specifically, but because I was a useful element in the argument he was preparing to make. A treaty consort from a foreign federation, visibly decorative, visibly ignorable. I was the most efficient way to open a case about the limits of Thessavel's judgment. Not her judgment in general, he couldn't attack without risking everything. Her judgment in this one appointment. This one concession to reach diplomacy. This one Article 14. He started the day of the first formal session, which was a deliberation on territorial jurisdiction near the pass. 17 people in the room, 4 of them Amriel's advisors, 6 of them the empresses, 3 administrative witnesses and me, seated at the far end of the table in my official capacity as integration observer, which was a real designation with real standing, regardless of the social register it had been filed under. Amriel opened the session formally and correctly, following the Orn deliberation protocol to the letter. He was precise and well prepared, which I had expected. He introduced his territorial claims with a clarity that was almost aggressive. Every citation placed exactly. Every procedural move anticipated. He had done his research. Then, in the second hour, he paused the territorial discussion on a procedural question, whether the integration observer's presence was appropriate, given that several of the jurisdictions touched on reach treaty obligations. It was a small move as those things go. Barely a challenge, more of an inquiry, technically, but it was pointed at me, and everyone in the room knew it. Thessavel answered before I could, which was protocol. She was the presiding authority in her own deliberation chamber. She said that the observer's stand was established under Article 14 and was not subject to procedural challenge within an integration discussion. Her voice was flat and precise, the same tone she used for every ruling. She was not defending me, exactly. She was correcting a procedural error, the same way she would have corrected a misquoted date. Amriel accepted the ruling with a bow of his head and returned to the territorial discussion. He did not look at me again for the rest of the session. That was day 1. Day 2 was a longer session, 6 hours across 2 sittings. Amriel had shifted his approach. He no longer questioned my standing. Instead, he developed a habit, subtle at first and then less subtle, of addressing the room's responses to points I raised as if I had not raised them. Not openly. He would not ignore what I had said directly. That would have been a procedural violation. He would instead take what I had said, let a half-beat of silence sit after it, and then continue speaking as if he were developing his own line of thought from scratch, and the court advisors would respond to him, and the point would move forward with his name on it rather than mine. It was done with precision. It was the kind of erasure that leaves no visible marks. I watched it happen 3 times before I understood the full architecture of what he was building. He was not just discrediting me. He was demonstrating to Thessavel's court that a human consort was a thing that could be passed over without consequence, that the room didn't actually need to register me in order to function. That Article 14 was an indulgence the sovereignty could afford to walk back without disturbing anything essential. What he did not know, and what I had spent 9 months quietly ensuring, was that I had built something in the gaps between being ignored. On the morning of the 3rd day, Amriel requested a formal record testimony session. This is an Orn legal mechanism that doesn't have a clean translation into reach procedure. It's part deliberation, part sworn deposition, and it operates under very specific rules about challenge and response. Any credentialed party in a deliberation can request it. Any credentialed party can be called to give account within it. The rules of evidence are strict. The rules of conduct are stricter. He requested it to examine the treaty basis for the consort designation, specifically, the Reach's justification for assigning a military intelligence analyst to the role. He had done his research on my background, which I had expected. He laid it out in the request with care. My 11 years in strategic affairs, 2 years embedded in conflict zone consular work, the specialized nature of my knowledge base. The question of whether a posting of this kind to a frontier fortress was a form of intelligence gathering rather than a genuine diplomatic appointment. He was telling the room that I was a spy. Not in those words. The Orn deliberation protocol doesn't permit direct accusations without proof, and he didn't have proof because there was none to find. But he had constructed a circumstantial case that landed in the room like a stone in still water, and he had done it in front of Thesavale, and he had done it formally, which meant it required a formal answer. I was the formal answer. The record testimony rules gave me the floor. The entire chamber was mine under those rules, as long as I needed to provide complete and accurate account. Amriel's advisors would have the right of challenge. Thesavale's advisors would have the right of clarification, but no one could interrupt until I had finished my initial account, and nothing I said, under record testimony, could be used against me outside the formal record without unanimous agreement of the presiding authority. Thesavale looked at me from the head of the table. She had been looking at me more since the second day, in the way I recognized from my years of watching rooms. Not watching the main performance, watching the thing in the corner of the frame to understand what the main performance was actually about. I stood up. I have been asked since what I was feeling in that moment. The honest answer is that I wasn't feeling what people expect. I was not frightened because I had already decided, somewhere in the quiet of the 8th month, that I was not going to break in this room regardless of what it cost me to hold. I was not angry, because anger is expensive, and I had learned not to carry it into a room where I needed precision. What I was feeling, standing up in that fortress deliberation chamber, with 17 pairs of Orn eyes on me and a warlord waiting for me to stumble, was something closer to relief. The waiting was over. Whatever I was in this room, it was about to be on record. I began at the beginning. Told them my full name, my rank, and my service record. Not summarized, not edited, but complete. The way you read a ledger, you intend to leave no questions about. 11 years in strategic affairs. The names of every posting. The dates. The commissions. The 2 field rotations in contested space. I had spent 6 months of my assignment at the Cathiel Gate cross-referencing those chords against the Orn's own archival system because I had known something like this was eventually going to be necessary, and when you are the kind of person I am, you prepare. I told them that my background in strategic intelligence was accurate, as Warlord Amriel had stated, and that it was also the reason I had been selected for this posting, was an integration process of the complexity of the Reachorn Treaty generates more information than a standard diplomatic team can process, and the Reach had determined, correctly, in my assessment, that an analyst's skill set was more useful in this context than a career diplomat's, because an analyst reads documents, and a diplomat manages relationships, and the documents were the actual problem. I told them what I had read. For the next hour and 40 minutes I went through, from memory, the complete informational landscape of the Reachorn integration, as I had assembled it over 9 months at the Cathiel Gate. Every territorial dispute that had arisen in the integration discussions, its history, the competing claims, and the resolution that the existing treaty language would support. Every procedural question that had been raised in the 3 negotiating sessions held near the pass, with the Reach position, the Orn position, and the gap between them. Every inconsistency in the Amriel territory's own submission to the integration process. The dates that did not align with the jurisdictional history, the boundary claims that contradicted their own earlier treaty submissions, the resource extraction permits that had been filed in a way that anticipated a territorial outcome the deliberations had not yet produced. I was not performing. I want to be precise about that. I was not showing off, not grandstanding, not using the record testimony rules to make a theatrical point. I was doing what I had been doing for 11 years in small rooms with difficult problems. I was reading the ledger out loud and not flinching at what it said. Amriel's advisors attempted challenge 3 times. The record testimony rules require that challenges be based on factual dispute. You cannot challenge opinion or interpretation, only verifiable fact. Each challenge they raised, I answered with the specific archival citation from the Cathiel Gate library system, which I had spent 9 months learning better than anyone else in that room, and in 2 of the 3 cases, The citation also happened to illuminate a contradiction in the Amrail territory's own filed documents that I had not yet raised. The third challenge collapsed on its own when the challenger, a senior Amrail advisor, misquoted the article he was citing. I had the correct text memorized and said it aloud, and the room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when a mistake has been made in a formal proceeding. I finished at the end of my account as the rules required, and I sat down. The ORN record testimony rules require a formal closing from the party who gave account, a declaration that the record is complete and accurate to the best of their knowledge, and that no material facts have been withheld. I gave it. My voice was steady. My hands, which no one had asked about, and which I had kept below the table's edge, were steady too. I had been more afraid in smaller rooms than this one, and I had learned, in those rooms, that fear and steadiness are not opposites. They coexist, if you let them. The chamber was still for long enough that I could hear the wind off the pass, through the high windows. Veth Amrail was looking at the table. Not at me, not at the Empress, not at his advisors. At the surface of the table, with the expression of a man recalculating something he had been confident about. I looked at Thesavel Orn. She was sitting very straight, which was not unusual. She always sat straight. But her hands, which were usually folded on the table in the precise arrangement of someone who has been trained to appear composed, were no longer folded. Her right hand was resting on the table, fingers slightly spread, as if she had just set something down. Her eyes, when they met mine, were not the careful blank they had been for 9 months. There was something in them I had not seen there before. Not softness, sharpness turned inward, the way a person looks when they are reassessing something they thought they understood. She held my gaze for 3 full seconds. In ORN deliberation protocol, 3 seconds of eye contact between a presiding authority and a party to the session is not neutral. It is a signal, and the signal has a name, acknowledgement of weight. She looked away. The session continued for another 2 hours. Amrail had changed approach again. He was completing his business. He was too disciplined to abandon the session after what had happened. But the architecture he had been building was gone. He was negotiating, which was what the session had nominally been about in the first place. I contributed twice more, both times briefly, both times in direct response to specific questions from Thesavel's senior advisor. Both times my answers were incorporated into the deliberation record without pause. The session concluded at the end of the afternoon. The formal closing was read by the Chamberlain. The parties began to disperse. I was still at the table, gathering the paper records I had requested access to 3 months earlier and been given without comment, when I became aware that the room had emptied except for 2 people, me and Thesavel Orn, who had not moved from the head of the table. I looked up. She was watching me, with the same inward sharpness I had seen in the deliberation. Senior court advisors were visible through the open door to the antechamber. "Far enough for courtesy, close enough for protocol," she said. "How long have you been building that account?" It was not a question about timeline, not really. I understood what she was asking. "Before I arrived," I said, "and every day since." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, rather than the shared trade language we had been using in deliberation. "You understood what this posting was?" "Yes," I said, in Orn. "You came anyway." "The Reach asked me to come. I do what I'm asked when the work is real." I paused. The work was real. The integration process is going to determine what happens at this pass for the next 100 years. I thought it was worth doing carefully. She looked at me with an expression I still, to this day, find difficult to name precisely. It was not guilt. She had done nothing that required guilt, by her own lights or by mine. It was not apology. It was the expression of someone who has applied a category to a thing, efficiently and without malice, who has just discovered that the category was wrong. And who is the kind of person who, when they discover they are wrong, looks directly at the error rather than away from it. "You were treated as a formality," she said. In Orn, the word she used has a secondary meaning, something that occupies space while the real matter is decided elsewhere. "Yes," I said. "That assessment was incorrect." "Yes," I said again. Did not say anything else. I am not, by nature, a person who needs the apology spelled out once the error has been acknowledged. She had acknowledged it. That was more than I had expected. And it was enough. She rose from the table. For a moment she was simply standing, and I was standing. And the room was the room, stone and iron, and the gray light of the mountain pass outside. And nothing dramatic happened. She did not touch my hand. She did not do the thing you see in stories where the cold person breaks open, and warmth floods out all at once. That is not what she was, and it is not what I was, and it is not what the moment was. What she did was meet my eyes again, directly, another count of 3. "Tomorrow," she said, "you will be seated at the primary table." She left. Primary table was where her senior advisors sat, not the integration observer's position at the far end. The primary table, which in the ORN deliberation system is not a courtesy designation, but a formal status indicator, one that required the empress's verbal assignment to change. I stood alone in the chamber for a moment, listening to the wind. Then, I gathered my papers and went to the library to prepare for the next session. I should tell you what happened the following morning, because that is the part of it people remember, and because I think it is important to tell it in the right order. Veth Amriel had not left the Cathiel Gate overnight. The Sovereignty Conference was still formally in session. Protocol required him to remain until the deliberations were complete. I saw him in the outer corridor before the morning session, speaking with 2 of his advisors, and he saw me. And there was a moment where the geometry of the corridor and the fact of my approaching required him to either step aside or not. He stepped aside. Not by much, not in any way that required him to acknowledge it, but he moved, which was more than he had done in the previous 3 days. In the morning session, I was seated at the primary table. I watched several of the Empress's court advisors register this and then consciously return their attention to their documents, which is the ORN way of absorbing a development without making the absorption visible. Amriel's senior advisor, the one who had misquoted the article the previous day, watched me for approximately 4 seconds and then looked at his own documents with a focus that was slightly more emphatic than necessary. The morning session moved quickly and without drama. The territorial questions were largely resolved. I had provided the framework the previous afternoon, and the parties were now filling in the details. I contributed where my record knowledge was relevant and said nothing when it wasn't. The formal closing of the final session, Thesavel Orn rose. The Orn closing ritual in a sovereignty conference is codified. Presiding authority summarizes the outcomes, acknowledges the parties, names the signatories to the formal record, and closes in the traditional phrase that translates, roughly, as this is bound by our witness. It is ceremonial, and it is exactly the same every time. The Chamberlain had a written text for it. Thesavel did not use the written text. She summarized the outcomes correctly and completely, in a way that was briefer and sharper than the written form. She acknowledged the Amriel territory's delegation with the standard phrase. She named the administrative signatories. Then she paused. The integration record, she said, acknowledges the contribution of Keldoran, attaché consort of the Orn sovereignty under Article 14, whose analysis informed the resolution of 17 jurisdictional questions across this conference, and whose service to the sovereignties deliberation process has been. She chose the next word with the deliberateness of someone selecting the right tool for a precise task. Substantive. In the Orn formal record system, substantive is a status designation. It means the contribution affected outcome. It is not applied to guests, or to observing parties, or to treaty placeholders. It is applied to people who did real work that the sovereignty is formally acknowledging. She continued. Position of attaché consort under Article 14 is, as of this conference, designated primary advisory standing before the Orn deliberative authority at the Cathiel Gate. This designation is made by my word, by treaty clause. She said it simply and without ceremony by my word. Not Article 14, not the Reach's assignment, her word. The room was still. I was looking at the table in front of me. I was holding myself very together, which is not the same as feeling nothing. I was thinking about 11 years of small rooms and difficult problems, and 2 years at posts where no one expected you to matter, and 9 months at a frontier fortress being politely invisible. And the question I had asked myself every single day of those 9 months, Whether you can hold together long enough to be of use when the moment comes. I had held together. Thesaville closed the session in the traditional phrase. The Chamberlain read the final procedural line. The parties rose. Amriel left with his retinue in the correct order and with the correct formalities. He had his outcomes, not the full range of what he'd come for, what the jurisdictional record would support, which was less than he'd hoped and more than he could reject. He would be back, I knew, with another angle prepared. That was his nature. But the angle he had built this week was gone. I was the last to leave the chamber, after the Empress's advisors filed out. I was almost at the door when I heard her voice behind me. I turned. She was standing by the window, nearest the head of the table, looking out at the pass. The light was cleaner than it had been in days. The cloud cover had broken, and the stone of the mountain above the gate caught the white of it and threw it back. She did not look at me immediately. She was looking at the pass, and then she was looking at something past the pass, the way people look when they are deciding what to say. Then she turned, and she looked at me with those gold-flecked amber eyes, and she said, "I should have asked you to sit a long time ago." Stood in the doorway, and I took a breath, and I said, "Yes." She held my gaze. "I am asking now," she said. "I want to be careful about how I end this, because the easy version is the wrong version. The easy version has her breaking open, and warmth flooding in, and a clean resolution that writes all the cold months in a single moment. That is not what happened. And I think you would know, if you have ever lived through the real version of something like this, that the real version is quieter and stranger and carries more weight in the long run than the easy one. What happened was, I sat, not in that room. In that moment, the session was closed. The chamber was not the right place for it. But later that evening, when her chamberlain came to my quarters, with a formal invitation to join the empress for the working dinner she held, with her senior advisors on the last night of any extended conference, I went. I sat at the table 2 places to her right, where one of the senior advisors had shifted to make room without ceremony. I was given food and wine, and the ordinary rhythms of a working conversation, and I contributed to the conversation when I had something to contribute, and did not when I didn't. And at the end of the evening, Thesaville Orn said good night to her advisors in the order of their standing, and she said good night to me by my name. It was the first time in 9 months she had said my name. It was not that night more than that. I do not want to make it into more than it was. She was beginning to know what I was. I was beginning to believe she wanted to. That was real, and it was enough, and it was the right foundation for what came after. What I can tell you is this. In the months that followed, as the integration work continued and the Cathedral Gate became less of a political holding pattern and more of the active sovereignty post it was meant to be, Thesaville Orn asked me to sit often. She asked me questions that were not about treaty positions. She listened in the way she listened to everything, completely, without rushing, but with a quality of attention that was different from the deliberation room, something that was turned toward me specifically rather than toward the information I carried. I learned in those months that she was not cold. She was precise and demanding and not given to waste of any kind. Not emotional waste, not verbal waste, not relational waste. She had applied the category of formality to me because the category had seemed to fit. And when the category broke, she had not defended it. She had looked directly at the error and corrected it. That, I came to understand, was how she did everything. It was why she was a good ruler and why she was not, in the end, easy to know, but worth the effort in a way that I have spent the years since being full for. 6 months after the Amriel Conference, in the formal deliberation record of the Cathedral Gate, my title was changed, not by treaty, not by Article 14, by the Empress's word, ratified in the official record by unanimous agreement of the senior court. The new title was, in Orn formal language, Consort of the Orn Sovereignty, Primary Advisory Standing, designated at the Cathedral Gate, named by her will. The Chamberlain read it aloud at the next full court session. I was standing in my position at the primary table, which was no longer the far end. I heard it read. I looked at Thesaville Orn. She was already looking at me, with the expression I had learned by then to read. The sharpness turned inward, and underneath it something quieter, The way light comes through stone if the stone is thin enough. She inclined her head. Not the minimal fraction of protocol, something more. I inclined mine. That was the whole of it in the moment. Everything else came after. And what I can tell you now, looking back from the distance of years, is that it was enough. That a room full of people watching a warlord try to break a man they had never thought to look at, and watching the man not break, can shift something in the room that doesn't shift back. That an empress who applies a category precisely and revises it honestly when the category fails is worth sitting beside. That the work of holding together, in the years of being invisible, is not wasted. It goes somewhere. It goes into the record. Article 14 was how I arrived. Her word was how I stayed.